So that's a nice segue, I guess, to the second part of the discussion, which is, I guess, about the economy. Because I guess Australia's always said, China's our main economic partner, the United States is our main security partner, and somehow we don't have to choose. But I guess that's been questioned as well. But I guess the status of America in the world economy has also been rethought, I guess, after the tariff war, etc. And I guess the world's ability to sort of, I guess, dust itself off and say, okay, see you later. But I've been noticing the comments of the economic historian Adam Tooze recently, and he gave a talk in Beijing just recently, which I'll just play a very short clip of just to give a sense of the thing. And he's talking about the significance, the scale, I guess, of the industrial transformation of China over the last 30 years. So let me just put this on stage.
Thinking about China's economic development, material economic development, especially the energy side of China's economic development, is whether or not we can, in fact, whether we have the terms and whether we have the historical experience large enough to do justice to the radicalism as what has happened, and therefore also the challenges that lie ahead. And part of my mission, as I see myself, in intervening in Western conversations in the current moment, especially on what you might call the progressive side of climate politics in the West, is to bring home the scale and the drama of what needs to happen and what will be driven by the Chinese side, what in fact is already being driven.
So, and he goes on in that talk to refer particularly to a chart that he has. I could only get the chart from 1900, but it's of coal production or consumption in the world. And if you could imagine this going back to pre-industrial revolution times, it's obviously very low. Then it bumps up in, the late 1700s. But what he really emphasizes is this astonishing increase on the right-hand side of the chart with China's use of coal since really from about 2000, but particularly from the mid 1970s. And he just says it almost forces us to kind of rethink economic history as such, really, because it's such a astonishing transformation. And the particular argument he's making is that in the context of climate policy, really the time in which the US and the West were crucial in terms of climate policy is gone, because it's just whatever it does is relatively minor compared to what China and I guess to some degree also India does. But he also really says, we really need to rethink just the scale of the real economic transformation that's occurred in China in terms of our models of how the world economy works. And you've been writing about this a bit on your Substack at warwickpowell.substack.com. Warwick, what are your reflections on this? I mean, I find Adam Tooze a really interesting thinker because he's always open to questioning facts about the world, I guess, and sort of changing his mind about things. But even if, I don't agree with him on everything, but what's your sense of what we've seen happen with the sort of trade war and stuff like that over the last 10 years, how people are coming to terms with the reality of China's role in the world economy?
Yeah, the trade wars.
Yeah.
Look, the trade wars, I think, has brought into sharp relief the fact that the United States economy simply doesn't have the same significance and leverage across the globe as it once did. So that's the first one. The second dimension, I think, actually reflecting on firstly the question of the abyss of empire is not only the economic role is diminishing relative to the rest of the world. But also, I think clearly the military projection has been diminishing, and we don't need to discuss that in too much detail at all. But I also think that the cultural story has diminished as well. And we've seen that in recent opinion polls globally about the relative status or the positive or negative ratings of, China and America. That's the one that a lot of people are interested in. But what it shows is that in recent times, the standing of the United States has diminished as well. And I think in part it's because the promises of the light on the hill, so to speak, are simply not being lived up to in practical realities. And the evidence of homelessness and opioid crises and assorted social ailments, domestic violence, murder, homicides, all those sorts of things have really, and I'll say this very diplomatically, I think, have really tarnished the reputation of the United States at a global level. So in economic, military, and in cultural terms, I think we are somewhere, going down the abyss as far as the empire is concerned. In terms of China, it's fascinating that a figure such as Tooze is coming to China now, if you will, intellectually, and confronting the sort of long-held mental models of how the world worked and how the world is, by reflecting on what has taken place in China over the course of not just the last 40 years, but over the course of the last 75, 80 years. China's transformation is beyond compare. That chart you showed was of energy produced by burning coal. And what's important about that is actually the question of how much energy has been produced. Put aside for the time being the source of energy, and just think about the trajectory and the steepness of that line and what that means in terms of the economic activity that is taking place in that particular society. Because push comes to shove, human economic systems are fundamentally thermodynamic energy systems. Humans interact with nature by harnessing energy and using energy and transforming energy. Energy doesn't disappear, we know that. It just changes form, and as it changes form, it becomes useful to us or not so useful. It's wasted or whatever. And one of the most significant features of economic development over the course of the last 300 odd years, from the outset, in particular of the Industrial Revolution, is the transformation in the energy efficiency of energy itself. So the energy return on energy invested, how much energy you get out for a given amount of energy you commit to a process, really transformed when coal and then subsequently oil became available to humans as the principal sources of energy. And over time, of course, what happens with that curve is that, and I mean the energy return on energy investment curve, Jeff, is that diminishes because the resource gets harder to get or it gets scarce. What China has done in the last 10 years is recognize that and has begun to augment its energy production systems with the next generation of energy, and that is through harnessing the sun, the wind, and those sorts of natural factors, and are now in a position to achieve, again, a rising energy return on energy investment process. The United States, on the other hand, is actually quite trapped in an energy system that experiences a diminishing return on energy invested, and that's largely because of the politics of energy in the United States, part of the ideology of it, but also because of the spatial distribution and the composition of the American Congress, So red states, tend to be particularly fossil fuel dependent from an economic point of view, and they play an outsized political role. But those sources and things like fracking are starting to experience diminishing energy returns on energy invested. And so the transformation that's taking place in China is that China's actually able to create a far greater amount of surplus energy. And I say this abstractly, but what that actually means is that they can then convert that into all sorts of other things, right? Because that's what the process is. And that is the reality. So if you think about the Asia region and American primacy was achieved during an era when America had access to highly efficient energy sources that it could transform through technologies into things like military capability and those sorts of things. It's simply not in the same position, relatively speaking, as it once was. So China's industrial development, which a lot of people focus upon, is actually underpinned by an energy transformation over that entire period of time. America is actually experiencing the downhill side, if you will, of having achieved peak energy efficiency some decades ago. The advent of financialization from the 1970s onwards bring those two forces together, and you actually get the hollowing out of industrial capability in the United States and the consequences socially, economically, militarily flow from that.
Yeah. And I guess it's also interesting what that energy has been used for, I guess, as well. I think, for example, I have this factoid in my head that the US military is the largest, carbon emitter in the world, kind of thing. So, whereas, China, with this astonishing use of energy, I think one of the other stats that Adam Tooze brings attention to is a lot of that economic growth hasn't just been about exporting, cheap goods to the West. It's actually been about the urbanization of China over the last, which is also, if you like, the social development and the housing of China, the lifting of whatever it is, billion people out of poverty over that period of time and placing them in, better housing. He says, I think 90% of Chinese people live in housing apartments that has been built since 1990. So, which is, if you think about, where we all live, is an or let alone America lives, the quality of infrastructure and urban infrastructure in America, it's a really astonishing statistic.
Look, about 60% now of the Chinese population is officially urbanized, living in proper sized townships and cities, and other people in the countryside, in villages, of course, are living actually in new houses as well, as you mentioned. I'll give you a personal anecdote. In 1988, I went back to my cousin's village in Guangdong province, about at that time a 3-hour drive from Guangzhou. These days, I suspect it's probably about a 45-minute drive, but in those days, it was a 3-hour drive. And I went with my cousin in a little lorry, and we had on the back of the lorry a refrigerator, a Japanese branded refrigerator, and a Japanese branded so the fridge and a washing machine and a television, not a washing machine. That was another case, but we had the TV and the fridge, and we trundled off down to the village to the grandparents, and we put these two newly acquired devices, which I actually brought over from Hong Kong, because in those days you needed what was called foreign exchange certificates to purchase imported goods. You couldn't. And foreign exchange certificates were essentially the foreign exchange equivalent of the domestic currency, but Chinese citizens were not permitted to have foreign exchange certificates. So you needed an overseas Chinese person to have those. So anyway, we took this gear down to the village, put the equipment pride of place in the ante room, the front room, invited everyone from the village over to have a look at, these new shining machines. And then they waited 3 years for electricity. And And so, electricity was the transformer of, of life. And that began the transformation journey for that village, and so urbanization, the building of infrastructure has gone hand in hand with rising incomes, commitments to education, which has increased the capability of the workforce, which has enabled the progressive value-adding capability of the economy at large. And that has resulted now, I guess, in a fairly sophisticated industrial economy that, as you mentioned, is actually mainly focused on serving the domestic market. About 80% of manufactured outputs is actually consumed domestically in China. And interestingly, on electric vehicles, which is the one that captures a lot of headlines today as the sort of export dominant category, about 90% of Chinese EV outputs are consumed domestically. So most of the things that are made in China is actually for the Chinese market. And until people actually grasp that, they will continue to have this misconceived mental map that Chinese economic development is export dependent. It's not. And this brings us then back to, again, the relative significance of the US economy. It's just simply not as important as it once was. The last thing I'll mention in this stanza, if you will, is this question of energy and what China's doing, not only for itself, but by creating the technologies that can harness renewable energies. China is exporting that capability now and delivering that at relatively low costs, or certainly at prices or costs that historically are unprecedented. They are more affordable today than they've ever been. And its ability to do that does a few things for the developing world, the global south. Firstly, it enables the global south to also begin to experience the benefits of electrification and what that then enables in a downstream context. At a very basic level, it delivers refrigeration to villages, but it also delivers lighting, which allows children to read at night and to, improve their education. And of course, it enables factories to emerge that require energy to mobilize machines, et cetera. But the second thing it does is that it strengthens energy sovereignty, which means that countries, and China is a classic case in point as a demonstration case itself, is that it is progressively less reliant on imported sources of energy and is more capable of meeting its energetic requirements through domestic resources. And for China, which is a country that is relatively short on, the other, the fossil fuels relative to its requirements, in some respects, of course, it had to explore these alternative energy sources. But in this current geopolitically fraught moment of history, to reduce exposure to risks of oil tankers being intercepted coming through the Straits of Malacca, for example, actually makes a lot of sense from a national security point of view as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's transition then to the third dimension of thing. I mean, the economic stuff is fascinating, and but people should absolutely check out your articles at warwickpowell.substack.com. Really, I think since I left government, I tend to give myself a pass from reading too much economic analysis. But Warwick's material is just brilliant, and it really explains what's happening really clearly, and sort of integrates also all the cultural dimensions. And